Tonight, we revisit a case that has become embedded in British memory. It concerns one woman, a single investigation, and a verdict that entered the national record and has never left. The story of Julia Martha Thomas opens in Richmond, Surrey, during the early months of 1879. At that time, Richmond was a town of approximately 12,000 residents, situated on the south bank of the River Thames, where the water bends westward toward Twickenham. By the standards of the period, the town was prosperous. Its character was overwhelmingly residential, and its population was drawn largely from the professional and retired middle classes. These were men and women of modest but comfortable means, who valued Richmond's proximity to the capital, while maintaining their distance from its crowded inner districts. The South Western Railway provided a direct connection to London, and the town streets near the river and Richmond Green were lined with Georgian and early Victorian cottages and terrace houses. These properties were well maintained and occupied in the respectable manner expected of the neighborhood. To the south lay Richmond Park, its vast enclosed acreage of royal land providing a quality of rural adjacency that lent the town a particular claim to gentility. Park Road, where this account begins, was a quiet residential street of modest cottages. These were occupied by widows, retired persons, and individuals of similar circumstances. Each cottage was equipped in the manner standard to households of this class and period, including the large cast iron boiling vessel fitted in the kitchen or outhouse and used for the laundering of linen. Such a vessel was referred to as a copper. Its presence at 2 Vine Cottages, Park Road, in the early months of 1879 was unremarkable. It would not remain so. Julia Martha Thomas was a widow of middle age, residing alone at 2 Vine Cottages at the time of her death. She had occupied the cottage for a period prior to the events of March 1879, and was known in her neighborhood as a woman of settled and predictable routine. She attended church each Sunday morning without exception, departing the cottage at a regular hour and returning in the afternoon along the same route through the same quiet streets. She maintained the household with the assistance of domestic servants, of whom she had engaged and then lost several in the period preceding January 1879. None had remained in her employment for any extended duration. The precise circumstances of her life before Richmond are not fully established in the surviving record. She was a widow, having taken the surname Thomas through marriage. Her late husband's given name is not confirmed in the sources available, and is not named in this account. She had no known children. Her financial circumstances appear to have been modest but sufficient, adequate to maintain the cottage, to keep a servant, and to sustain the routine of a respectable widow of her station. The precise source of her income was not examined in detail during the proceedings that followed her death. Those who knew her described her as a woman of firm opinions and demanding domestic expectations, inclined to find fault with the conduct of those in her service. The pattern of servants dismissed or departed from Vine Cottages before the events of this account is consistent with these contemporary descriptions. At the opening of 1879, Julia Thomas was living alone without domestic help, and she had placed an advertisement for a new servant. She was a woman in her 50s. She was regular in her habits and known in her community. The record of Julia Thomas's life before the engagement of January 1879 is limited in its surviving detail. She was a widow of settled circumstance. She was known in her neighborhood and at her church. She had engaged a new domestic servant as the year began, completing a sequence of arrangements that had not previously produced a stable household. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now, Back to the record. The woman engaged as domestic servant at 2 Vine Cottages in January 1879 was Catherine Webster, known as Kate Webster. Webster had been born in County Wexford, Ireland, around the year 1849, though sources differ on the precise year. She had immigrated to England at some point in her younger years, likely in her late teens or early 20s, and had established herself in the working class districts of South and West London in the years that followed. By the time of her engagement with Julia Thomas, Webster had accumulated a criminal record of considerable extent. She had been convicted of theft on multiple occasions and had served more than 1 term of imprisonment in England, including at least 1 sentence served at Wandsworth Prison in Surrey. The specific convictions and their dates require verification against the criminal registers of the period. The general pattern, however, is well attested. Webster had moved between positions and localities over the years preceding 1879, sustaining herself through petty theft and domestic employment obtained without disclosure of her history to her employers. She had an illegitimate son. The child was being cared for by associates elsewhere at the time of her engagement with Julia Thomas, and did not reside at Vine Cottages during the period in question. Webster had worked in a succession of domestic situations across South and West London before her arrival at Richmond. She had departed each previous position under circumstances connected to suspicion or confirmed evidence of dishonesty. She was described by those who knew her as physically strong and capable of considerable physical exertion. She was possessed of sufficient presence and composure to present herself, when occasion required, as a competent and reliable domestic servant. She had a network of acquaintances in the working class community through which she moved, acquired through years of residence in the same general area of outer South London. Among these acquaintances was a man named John Church, a publican who kept a house in the vicinity of Hammersmith. Webster knew Church and others in the area through the connections of shared neighborhood and social circumstance. The precise nature of Webster's relationship with Church at the time of her engagement with Julia Thomas was not defined in detail in the evidence produced at the subsequent proceedings, but his name would recur throughout the investigation and trial that followed. Webster presented herself for the position at 2 Vine Cottages. Her history was not disclosed. She was engaged. She took up residence in the cottage in January 1879. The preceding circumstances that brought Kate Webster to the door of 2 Vine Cottages formed a pattern familiar to those who would later reconstruct it. A woman with a history she could not declare, moving between positions of brief duration, each ending in departure or dismissal, arriving at each new situation under conditions that made discovery unlikely until some later point. That this particular engagement would end as it did was not apparent at the time of her arrival at Richmond. The cottage contained 2 women, employer and servant, in what had every appearance of the ordinary domestic arrangement it was intended to be. The relationship between Julia Thomas and Kate Webster deteriorated with considerable rapidity following Webster's arrival in the household. Thomas maintained precise requirements for the management of her domestic arrangements, and her tolerance for imprecision was, by the consistent account of those who had known her in previous employment arrangements, limited. Webster had neither the training nor the disposition to meet these requirements with consistent reliability. She had obtained the position without disclosing the record that would have rendered her unsuitable in the view of any employer of Thomas's expectations. The friction that developed between the 2 women was not unusual in its general character. Disputes between mistresses and servants over the execution of household duties were common in this period and rarely rose to formal notice. What distinguished this particular friction was its rapid escalation and its conclusion. Within weeks of Webster's arrival at Vine Cottages, Thomas determined to bring the arrangement to an end. She gave Webster notice in the final days of February 1879. The precise date has not been confirmed in the available record. The notice appears to have been served some days before the 2nd of March. The engagement was at an end. Webster was dismissed. For Webster, the giving of notice carried consequences that extended beyond the loss of a position. It removed her lodging, her daily meals, and her wages at a point when she had few alternatives and no disclosed history that would ease the obtaining of a new situation. Her criminal record, were it to become known, would close the majority of respectable domestic positions to her. She had a child to support, however indirectly, through whatever arrangements were in place for his care. The position at Vine Cottages, modest and contentious as it had proven, had represented a settled situation that could not be easily replaced. In the days that remained of the notice period, Webster continued to reside at the cottage, conducting whatever residual duties were required of her. She and Thomas occupied the same small rooms, the same domestic spaces in the proximity that a cottage of these dimensions imposed upon those who shared it. There were no other residents. There were no witnesses to whatever exchanges occurred between them during those final days. On the morning of Sunday, the 2nd of March 1879, Julia Thomas departed Vine Cottages at her customary hour and attended the church she had attended each week without interruption. She was seen by members of the congregation who knew her. She was observed returning to the cottage in the afternoon. The afternoon advanced into evening. She did not emerge from the house again. The circumstances, as they stood on the evening of the 2nd of March 1879, were these: a dismissed servant in the final days of her notice, without settled prospects, occupying the same small cottage as the woman who had dismissed her. The neighborhood continued its Sunday. Nothing from the exterior of 2 Vine Cottages indicated what was occurring within it that evening, and nothing would indicate it for some days to come. What occurred within 2 Vine Cottages on the evening of the 2nd of March 1879 was established through the evidence presented at the subsequent trial, and through the testimony of those witnesses who could speak to what they had observed immediately before and after that evening. The sequence, as reconstructed through the proceedings, was as follows. Julia Thomas returned to the cottage on the afternoon of Sunday, the 2nd of March, after attending church, as had been her established practice. That evening, an altercation occurred between Thomas and Webster within the cottage. The precise circumstances in which the altercation began are not documented with certainty in the available record. What the medical evidence established at the subsequent trial was that Julia Thomas was attacked and strangled. She died within the cottage at 2 Vine Cottages, Park Road, Richmond, during the evening of the 2nd of March 1879. She was a woman in her 50s in her own home, at the hands of the servant she had dismissed. In the days that followed the murder, Kate Webster undertook a sustained series of actions, directed toward the concealment of what she had done. The body of Julia Thomas was dismembered within the cottage over the course of the days following the 2nd of March. The domestic copper, the large cast iron laundry vessel fitted in the kitchen at Vine Cottages, was employed in the process. Portions of the remains were subjected to heat. This was established in evidence at the subsequent trial and was reported extensively in the press at the time. At some point during the days following the murder, Webster offered a quantity of rendered fat to a neighbor, representing it as best dripping. The neighbor declined. This incident was given in testimony at both the inquest and the trial, and entered the permanent record of the case. Webster packed the dismembered remains into a wooden box. She required assistance in transporting the box from the cottage, and for this purpose she enlisted a man named Henry Porter, an acquaintance. Porter assisted in carrying the box from the premises. The box was conveyed to the vicinity of the Thames at Barnes and deposited there. The head was not placed in the box. It was disposed of separately by means that the investigation of 1879 did not establish with certainty, and at a location that the proceedings of that year did not identify. The head was not recovered in 1879. Having disposed of or concealed the remains, Webster remained at 2 Vine Cottages. She occupied the house in the days that followed the murder, as though she were its lawful resident. She dressed herself in Julia Thomas's clothing. She wore Thomas's jewelry. In the days immediately following the murder, she began selling Thomas's furniture and personal effects, enlisting John Church, the publican of her acquaintance in Hammersmith, in the disposal of the household's contents. Church later maintained that he had no knowledge of the circumstances surrounding the furniture's availability and was ultimately acquitted of any involvement in the crime. Webster represented herself to various tradespeople and acquaintances in Richmond as the occupant of the cottage, assuming, to the extent that the situation permitted, the position and appearance of the woman whose home she was inhabiting. She moved through Thomas's residence, wearing Thomas's clothes, dispensing Thomas's possessions, conducting herself as the household's mistress. The actions taken by Kate Webster in the days following the 2nd of March constituted an extended effort to conceal the murder and to convert the victim's property to her own use. The record of these days, reconstructed through witness testimony at the subsequent trial, forms one of the most detailed portions of the evidentiary foundation of this case. The record received it in full. The discovery of what remained of Julia Thomas came by 2 distinct routes, and neither was immediately connected to the other. On or about the 5th of March 1879, a wooden box was recovered in the vicinity of Barnes on or near the northern bank of the Thames. Barnes at that period it was a working riverside district, a stretch of bank accessible to those who used the Thames for commercial and domestic purposes, situated some distance from the more frequented reaches of the central London waterfront, but not remote from the routines of those whose work brought them to the river. The box was found and reported to the appropriate authorities. The remains within it were identified as those of a human adult female, dismembered and in a condition reflecting the passage of several days and the application of heat to portions of the material. The discovery was received by officers of the relevant constabulary, and a coroner was notified. The identity of the woman whose remains had been placed in the box and deposited at Barnes was not at the point of discovery established. The investigation into the Barnes find was opened as a question without an immediate answer. The second direction from which suspicion gathered came from Julia Thomas's own neighborhood and from the church she had attended without interruption throughout her residence at Richmond. Thomas was a woman of fixed and public routine. Her absence from church on the Sunday following the 2nd of March was noticed by members of the congregation who had known her. She did not appear in her street in the days that followed. She did not respond to any inquiry. Neighbors who had occasion to observe the comings and goings at 2 Vine Cottages noted the presence of Kate Webster in the house and the absence of Julia Thomas with increasing unease. They noted that furniture was being removed from the cottage and that Webster was conducting herself as though the premises were her own. The combination of Thomas's unexplained absence and Webster's unusual behavior began, in the days immediately following the murder, to attract precisely the kind of notice that Webster's continued kidnapped presence at Richmond could not withstand. The two lines of inquiry, the unidentified remains recovered at Barnes and the missing woman of Park Road, Richmond, were brought into connection through the accumulation of circumstantial evidence, gathered from both directions, and the application of the investigative resources available to the Surrey Constabulary and the Metropolitan Police in the weeks that followed. The investigation was formally opened. Officers were dispatched to the relevant addresses and to the locations associated with the disposal of the remains and the sale of Thomas's property. Statements were taken from those who had had any dealings with Julia Thomas or with Kate Webster in the period surrounding the events of March 1879. Neighbors in Park Road were interviewed regarding their observations during the days following the 2nd of March. Members of Thomas's church gave accounts of her final attendance and of her unexplained subsequent absence. Individuals who had purchased items from Webster in the days after the murder were identified through inquiry and their accounts recorded. Tradespeople who had been approached by Webster in connection with the sale of household contents were sought out and their testimonies taken. The process of identifying and locating witnesses proceeded through the network of acquaintances, neighbors, and commercial contacts that the ordinary domestic life of a woman in Thomas's position had produced. John Church, the Hammersmith publican, came to the attention of the investigating officers in the course of these inquiries. He was questioned regarding his involvement in the disposal of furniture from Vine Cottages and gave a statement asserting that he had acted in good faith without knowledge of the circumstances surrounding the furniture's availability. He was subsequently placed under arrest on suspicion of complicity in the murder. The question of Church's knowledge and involvement became a significant element of the subsequent legal proceedings, and Webster would seek to make substantial use of it in her own defense. Henry Porter, who had assisted Webster in transporting the wooden box to Barnes, was identified and interviewed. His testimony established a direct evidentiary connections between the box recovered at Barnes and the cottage at Vine Cottages, and provided an account of Webster's role in the conveyance of the remains to the river. Porter stated that he had carried the box without knowledge of its contents. The evidence produced at the subsequent proceedings did not establish that Porter had known what the box contained, and no charge was brought against him in connection with the murder. His account of the events surrounding the transport of the box was nonetheless a critical element of the prosecution's case, establishing the chain from the premises at Park Road to the riverbank at Barnes. Before the full weight of the investigation could close upon her, Webster left Richmond. She made her way to Ireland, returning to the country of her birth and the county of Wexford. A warrant for her arrest was issued. She was located in Ireland and apprehended. She was returned to England to face the proceedings against her. Upon her return, and in the course of the formal proceedings that followed, Webster denied the murder. She sought to direct the investigation and ultimately the jury toward John Church, contending that Church had been responsible for the killing and that she had been coerced or deceived into assisting in the concealment. This account was advanced as her primary line of defense and would be presented again at her trial. The investigation had, by the time Webster was returned to face proceedings, assembled a body of circumstantial evidence of considerable extent and coherence. The remains recovered from the Thames at Barnes had been subjected to medical examination. Thomas's personal property, including clothing, jewelry, and household furniture had been found in Webster's possession or traced to transactions Webster had conducted in the days following the murder. Multiple witnesses had placed Webster in Thomas's cottage, wearing Thomas's clothing and presenting herself as the household's occupant. The chain of evidence connecting Webster to the death of Julia Thomas, the disposal of the remains, the impersonation of the victim, and the fraudulent conversion of the victim's property was extensive and founded on the testimony of a substantial number of witnesses. The investigation had identified a perpetrator, secured her return to face English justice, and assembled a case founded on physical evidence, witness testimony, and the documented trail left by Webster's own actions in the days following the murder. The case was prepared for submission to the formal legal process. A post-mortem examination of the remains recovered from the Thames at Barnes was conducted by medical witnesses, whose findings were entered into the official record and subsequently presented in evidence at the trial. The remains, as received by the examining surgeons, consisted of dismembered portions of a human body. They were identified as the remains of an adult female. The condition of the remains reflected the application of heat to portions of the material, consistent with the boiling process described by witnesses who had observed or been approached by Webster in the days following the murder. The examining surgeons gave evidence regarding the cause of death as they were able to determine it from the available physical evidence. The cause of death was established as strangulation. This determination was reached on the basis of the physical evidence presented by the remains in conjunction with the surrounding circumstantial evidence as to the manner in which the death had occurred. The strangulation finding was consistent with the account of events as reconstructed through witness testimony and as eventually admitted by Webster herself in her final confession. The examination of the remains was conducted with the limitations necessarily imposed by the condition in which they were received. The process of dismemberment and the partial application of heat had substantially altered the physical evidence available to the examining surgeons. The identification of the remains as those of Julia Thomas rested in the first instance on the determination that they were those of an adult female, consistent in physical characteristics with Thomas's age and stature, combined with the circumstantial evidence connecting the box in which they were found to the cottage at Vine Cottages. The precise identity of the deceased could not be established from the physical evidence of the remains alone, as the condition of those remains precluded the conventional means by which such identification might have been made. The identification was therefore achieved by the convergence of physical evidence and the substantial body of circumstantial evidence derived from the investigation. The head of the deceased was absent. It had been disposed of separately from the remainder of the remains and was not available for examination. The post-mortem findings established the fact of violent death, confirmed the cause as strangulation, and provided the medical foundation upon which the prosecution would present its case. These findings were entered into the official record and formed a component of the evidence laid before the coroner's inquest and subsequently before the jury at the Old Bailey. The medical record of this case was incomplete in the most literal sense. The remains were partial, the identification was inferential in part, and the head of the deceased was absent from the examination. The medical evidence established what it could establish given the material available to it. The findings were sufficient to support the formal proceedings that followed. An inquest was convened following the completion of the post-mortem examination and the gathering of the preliminary evidence by the investigating officers. The proceedings were held before the presiding coroner for the relevant district. Testimony was received under oath from a succession of witnesses whose evidence bore upon the identity of the deceased, the circumstances of her death, and the actions of Kate Webster in the period following the 2nd of March 1879. The witnesses called before the inquest included those who had known Julia Thomas in her Richmond neighborhood and at her church. They gave testimony regarding the regularity of her habits and the last occasions on which she had been observed alive. They described the circumstances in which Thomas's absence had come to their attention and the observations they had made regarding Kate Webster's presence in and about the cottage during the days that followed the murder. Witnesses who had been approached by Webster in connection with the sale of Thomas's furniture and personal effects gave their accounts of those transactions. Henry Porter gave testimony regarding the transport of the wooden box to Barnes. Those who had observed Webster wearing Thomas's clothing and presenting herself as the household's occupant gave their accounts. Medical witnesses testified regarding the findings of the post-mortem examination, presenting to the inquest the conclusions regarding cause of death and the physical characteristics of the remains recovered at Barnes. The evidence connecting the Barnes remains to the cottage at Vine Cottages and to the person of Julia Thomas was laid before the inquest in full. The jury considered the evidence as presented and returned its finding. The deceased was Julia Martha Thomas. The death was willful murder. Kate Webster was responsible for that murder. The coroner's jury returned these findings, and Webster was committed to stand trial at the Central Criminal Court in London. The inquest had received the evidence, assessed it, and produced the result that the investigation's findings warranted. The formal legal process was now to commence. The trial of Kate Webster on the charge of the willful murder of Julia Martha Thomas commenced at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, London, in July of 1879. The precise opening date of the proceedings requires verification against the court's records. But the trial was conducted in the mid-portion of that month and concluded within a relatively brief period by the standards of major criminal trials of the era. The Old Bailey at this period was the principal criminal court of England and Wales, situated in the city of London, and it was to this court that the most serious criminal matters arising within its jurisdiction were sent for trial. The courtroom in which Webster was tried was, by contemporary accounts, crowded. The case had attracted extensive public and press interest from the moment of the discovery of the remains at Barnes, and that interest had not diminished in the months between the discovery and the commencement of the trial. The presiding judge was Mr. Justice Hawkins, one of the most prominent members of the judiciary of the late Victorian period, known for the precision of his management of complex criminal trials. His conduct of proceedings in major cases during this era was closely observed by the press and legal profession alike. The prosecution presented its case through the evidence of a succession of witnesses whose testimony, taken in sequence, was directed toward establishing the complete chain of events from the final days of Julia Thomas's life to the flight of Kate Webster to Ireland. The evidence opened with the establishment of Julia Thomas as a woman of settled routine and fixed local presence, known to her neighbors, known at her church, and known to have engaged Kate Webster as her domestic servant in January 1879. The change in that routine, Thomas's sudden and unexplained absence from church, from her street, and from the ordinary commerce of her daily life from the 3rd of March 1879 onward, was documented through the testimony of those who had known her. Witnesses testified to the observations they had made of Webster at Vine Cottages in the days following the murder. They described seeing Webster dressed in clothing identified as belonging to Julia Thomas. They described the sale of furniture, the removal of household contents, and Webster's conduct as though the cottage were her own. Those who had been approached by Webster in connection with the sale of Thomas's property testified to the transactions they had undertaken and identified the items involved as belonging to the deceased. John Church gave testimony regarding his own involvement in the disposal of the furniture and his dealings with Webster during this period. Henry Porter's testimony established for the jury the chain of events by which the wooden box containing the remains had been conveyed from the cottage at Vine Cottages to the riverside at Barnes. Porter described the circumstances in which he had assisted Webster with the box. His testimony placed Webster at the center of the disposal and provided the direct evidentiary link between the premises at Richmond and the remains discovered at Barnes. Medical witnesses testified regarding the post-mortem findings, establishing the cause of death as strangulation and confirming the physical characteristics of the remains as consistent with those of an adult female of Julia Thomas's approximate age. They addressed, under examination, the implications of the dismemberment and the application of heat to portions of the remains, and they gave their professional opinion regarding the manner in which death had occurred. The evidence of Webster's flight to Ireland was placed before the jury as a component of the prosecution's case, bearing on the consciousness of guilt that departure immediately upon discovery might reasonably indicate. The warrant that had been issued and the circumstances of Webster's return to face proceedings in England were documented. The prosecution's case, as presented to the jury, rested on the convergence of multiple distinct lines of evidence, rather than on any single decisive proof. There was no eyewitness to the murder itself. The identification of the remains as those of Julia Thomas was inferential in part. The case was circumstantial in its structure, but comprehensive in its extent. The number of witnesses, the consistency of their individual accounts, and the coherence of the chain they collectively described were presented as the foundation upon which the jury was invited to reach its conclusion. The defense presented on Webster's behalf relied primarily on the contention that John Church had committed the murder and that Webster had been coerced or deceived into concealing it. This argument required the jury to accept that Church, who had been tried separately and acquitted, had in fact been the perpetrator. It required the jury to disregard or significantly discount the testimony of the many witnesses whose accounts placed Webster at the center of the disposal, the impersonation, and the fraudulent conversion of Thomas's property. The defense also challenged the identification of the Barnes remains as those of Julia Thomas, directing the jury's attention to the absence of the head and the inferential character of the identification. Neither argument succeeded in displacing the substance of what the prosecution had laid before the jury. Webster maintained her denial throughout the proceedings. She did not confess at trial. The account she gave, directing responsibility toward John Church, was the account she held to in the courtroom. The jury heard the full evidence on both sides and retired to deliberate. The jury returned its verdict. Kate Webster was found guilty of the willful murder of Julia Martha Thomas. The verdict was entered in the record of the Central Criminal Court. The prosecution's case had been accepted. The jury had rejected the defense's arguments in their entirety. The finding of guilty stood. The court proceeded to the matter of sentence. Mr. Justice Hawkins addressed the court and the convicted woman following the return of the verdict. His remarks, as reported in the press accounts of the proceedings, spoke to the character of the crime, as it had been established in evidence. He observed that the murder of Julia Thomas had been followed by a sustained and deliberate effort to destroy the evidence of it, to conceal the identity of the victim, to dispose of the remains by means calculated to prevent discovery, and to assume the position and property of the woman who had been killed. He pronounced the sentence of death. Kate Webster was to be held in custody until the date appointed for her execution, at which time the sentence was to be carried out within the walls of the prison, as required under the law governing the conduct of executions since the passage of the Capital Punishment Amendment, Act of 1868. The sentence was received without apparent disturbance in the courtroom. Webster was removed from the dock. The proceedings at the Central Criminal Court were concluded. The press in attendance recorded the sentence and the circumstances of its delivery, and their accounts appeared in the editions of the major London and national papers within hours and days of the trial's conclusion. The Times gave the proceedings detailed coverage. The Richmond and Twickenham Times, for which the case was a matter of immediate local significance, reported the verdict and sentence extensively. The penny press and the broadside trade produced accounts directed at a readership for whom the combination of murder, dismemberment, impersonation, and the condemned female servant represented the full measure of what such publications existed to convey. Public sentiment, as reflected in the press coverage of the period, did not register any significant movement in favor of clemency. No substantial petition for the reprieve of Kate Webster was generated in the weeks between the verdict and the execution. The case had not produced the kind of contested facts or disputed identification that might have given rise to organized advocacy against the sentence. The conviction rested on extensive and coherent evidence. Webster's own conduct in the days following the murder, the evidence of impersonation and fraud, and the sustained efforts to dispose of the remains had all been established through witnesses whose accounts the jury had accepted. Sir Richard Cross, who held the office of Home Secretary at the time, received no compelling grounds for the exercise of the prerogative of mercy. No reprieve was granted. Kate Webster remained at Wandsworth Prison in the weeks following the verdict, held under the conditions applicable to convicted prisoners awaiting execution. The date of the execution was set for the 29th of July, 1879. The sentence was pronounced. The date was set. The interval between verdict and execution proceeded in the manner standard to the period. On the morning of the 29th of July, 1879, Kate Webster made a confession to the prison chaplain at Wandsworth. The fact of this confession is well attested in the contemporary record, including the accounts carried in the press in the days immediately following the execution. The content of the confession, as reported through the chaplain's subsequent account, included a statement by Webster that she had murdered Julia Thomas. It also included a statement directed to the position of John Church. Webster stated in the confession she made that morning that John Church bore no responsibility for the crime. She had, at trial, advanced his culpability as the foundation of her defense. In the hours before her execution, she withdrew that account. Church's acquittal had already been entered in the court record, but the confession provided, in the form of the perpetrator's own dying statement, a confirmation of what the trial's outcome had effectively established. The record received the confession. The execution proceeded. William Marwood carried out the execution. Marwood had succeeded William Calcraft as the official executioner of England in 1874 and had conducted the majority of executions of the period. His method, which employed a calculated drop designed to produce instant death, rather than the slow strangulation associated with earlier practice, was regarded in the period as a more humane application of the capital sentence. The execution was conducted within the walls of Wandsworth Prison, as the 1868 legislation required. Before the prison governor, the chaplain, a medical officer, and the small number of official witnesses the law prescribed. There was no public attendance. The crowds that had gathered outside prisons at public executions in the decades before 1868 were not present at Wandsworth on the 29th of July 1879. The execution was conducted, witnessed by the appointed officials, and recorded in the prison's register. Webster's demeanor in her final hours was described in the press accounts as composed. The press relied on the accounts given by prison officials and the chaplain, and such accounts of condemned prisoners in their final hours are not always reliable in their particulars. What the record establishes is that she made her confession, received the ministrations of the chaplain, and was executed at the appointed time on the 29th of July 1879. She was buried within the grounds of Wandsworth Prison, as was the standard practice for executed prisoners of the period. No external burial was arranged. The record of her interment was entered in the prison register. The execution of Kate Webster on the 29th of July 1879 brought the formal legal proceedings of this case to their conclusion. The murder had been committed on the 2nd of March. The trial had concluded in July. The execution followed within days of the sentence. From the discovery of the remains at Barnes to the closing of the prison register at Wandsworth, the case had proceeded through every stage of the Victorian criminal process within the space of less than 5 months. The record was complete in its formal dimensions. The question of the missing head remained unanswered. It would remain so for 131 years. The case of Julia Martha Thomas and the trial and execution of Kate Webster entered the contemporary record through the most extensive channels available to the late Victorian press. The Times had followed the case from the initial discovery of the remains at Barnes through the execution at Wandsworth, producing detailed accounts at each significant stage. The Richmond and Twickenham Times covered it as the most significant local case of its generation. The penny press issued accounts for a popular readership, and the broadsides that had long been the standard medium for communicating the details of notable crimes and executions to those outside the reach of the daily papers were produced in connection with the case in its conclusion. In the decades following the trial, the case was included in the collections of notable British trials and criminal histories that formed the standard reference literature of Victorian and Edwardian true crime. It was among the cases selected for treatment in the true crime anthologies that accumulated through the late 19th and early 20th centuries as a recognized genre of popular history. Historians of Victorian crime, of domestic service, and of women and the law in the 19th century returned to it as a case that illustrated, within the compass of a single criminal event, several of the period's most significant social anxieties. The vulnerability of the solitary middle-class woman dependent on hired domestic help, the dangers attendant on a servant class whose members could conceal their histories, and the capacity of the criminal process to pursue, identify, and prosecute, even in the absence of a complete set of remains. The case remained a fixture of British true crime literature throughout the 20th century. It appeared in collections dedicated to Victorian murder, in studies of female perpetrators of violent crime, and in historical treatments of the Victorian domestic servant's position. Its combination of elements, the murder in a respectable Surrey cottage, the disposal of the remains in a domestic copper, the impersonation of the victim, the flight to Ireland, the confession on the morning of execution, gave it a density of incident that sustained its presence in the literature of the period long after cases of comparable contemporary notoriety had faded from repeated treatment. In October 2010, during construction work carried out in the garden of a residential property in Mayfield Road, Richmond, a human skull was unearthed. The property had formerly been the residence of Sir David Attenborough, the broadcaster and naturalist. Mayfield Road stands in the vicinity of Park Road, in the area where Vine Cottages had been situated. The skull was submitted for forensic examination. The assessment was conducted by specialists at the Museum of London, including Professor Caroline Wilkinson. Forensic analysis determined that the skull belonged to a woman aged approximately 50 to 60 years at the time of death, consistent with Julia Thomas's age in 1879. The skull was assessed as being approximately 130 years old, consistent with a date of death in the 1870s. The forensic conclusion reached was that the skull was almost certainly that of Julia Thomas, though the assessment stopped short of absolute certainty, as the condition and the available comparative material did not permit the kind of identification that would meet the highest forensic threshold. Sir David Attenborough, when informed of the discovery, remarked publicly on the extraordinary circumstance that the skull of the murdered woman had lain in the garden for 130 years. The assessment was widely reported. The skull was the missing element of the case. The head that had been disposed of separately in March 1879 and had not been located in the course of the 1879 investigation. It had not been in the Thames. It had been in a Richmond garden, a short distance from where the murder had been committed. For the full duration of the intervening century and more, the case of Julia Martha Thomas is regarded by historians of Victorian crime as one of the defining criminal cases of the 1870s and as one of the most thoroughly documented female perpetrator cases of the Victorian era. It is significant in the history of forensic investigation as an instance in which the perpetrator's efforts to destroy the physical evidence of the crime by dismemberment and the application of heat were ultimately insufficient to prevent identification and conviction, demonstrating the extent to which the convergence of circumstantial evidence could substitute for the direct physical evidence that the destruction of the body had been intended to eliminate. The impersonation sequence that followed the murder, Webster's days in the cottage wearing Thomas's clothing and selling Thomas's possessions, occupied a particular position in the public memory of the case. It represented a dimension of calculated conduct beyond the murder itself that impressed observers at the time and has continued to distinguish the case in historical treatment. The sustained effort to assume the identity of the victim, to become in the domestic and commercial spaces of Richmond the woman who had been killed, added to the case a quality that the press and the public found difficult to set aside. The case also occupied a specific position in the social history of the late Victorian period. The relationship between Julia Thomas and Kate Webster was the relationship between employer and servant, between a woman of modest middle-class respectability and a woman of working-class Irish immigrant background with a history of imprisonment. The press treatment of the case in 1879 drew heavily on existing anxieties about Irish domestic servants and the risks associated with engaging servants whose backgrounds could not be verified. Webster's Irish origins were referenced in press coverage in terms that reflected the nativist assumptions of the period, rather than the impartial vocabulary of forensic record. These dimensions of the case's contemporary reception are part of its historical record, though they belong to the history of the press and public discourse of the period, rather than to the evidence that determined its outcome. The conviction rested on evidence. The evidence was sufficient. The verdict was correct. The subsequent confession confirmed what the jury had established through the proceedings at the Old Bailey. The case as a legal matter was concluded on the 29th of July 1879 with the execution at Wandsworth. The case as a historical matter has not concluded. The discovery in 2010 returned it to public attention and demonstrated that the physical evidence of the crime had outlasted the investigation that sought it, the trial that prosecuted it, and the century and more that separated the murder from the spade that turned the Richmond garden. The record had been incomplete in one specific and material respect since March 1879. The 2010 discovery did not formally close that incompleteness, as the forensic identification stopped short of absolute certainty, but it addressed it to the extent that the available evidence permitted. The case of Julia Martha Thomas was the single matter examined in this account. The conviction was entered. The execution was carried out in 1879. The case became part of the national record. It has not left